Dmitri Potapenko is a Russian businessman, radio host, video blogger, writer, and a civil activist. This interview to Radio Svoboda, Liberty, was recorded on November 1st, 2022. What are we discussing here? These are those freaks that are all the time talking about it. Russia is selling less gas and oil. How much less? I told you that war costs pennies. Will people feel all the difficulties of the war? People's incomes are falling for a decade. That's a great news for the military operation. To work under the emergency conditions, they created a coordination council at the government. Well, nothing will change fundamentally. What about the economy of Ukraine? It doesn't exist physically, and that's the problem. Passage of time with Mumin Shakirov. Dmitry, good afternoon. Hundreds of Western companies left the Russian market, and Putin in his speech in Valdai Forum, he was kind of happy that Russian co-owners of those companies bought a share of the international partners for nothing. Where is the advantages and disadvantages? Well, see, each company is interested in working in a market. In an African market, people work too. It depends on what assets they left there. When Mercedes leaves the country, they understand there that the market is not there anymore. The sales volume is insignificant. So in other words, you have to fight over the poor people. It's a huge territory with low logistics, with low income, and with overly indebted people. Can they come back? They can, but different companies will come who work in trash segments. These are different segments that are not so-called civilized world companies. In other words, you'll have to raise people's income in order for these companies to come back. But how you can do this? Oil and gas revenues enough to exist, but not enough for development. Nevertheless, Putin sees advantages of special military operation. He says, we can now do on our own, and we will keep our economic sovereignty. What about that? The advantage is that for all those old farts who are still in power, they have a lot to work on. They have so-called women around them, and that's a great win for them. And in their picture of the world and their system of coordinates, that's a great thing. This is how they imagine this. I don't see any other advantage for them. Because what happened, they sent all men to front, to death, and now, like any feudal lords, they stay with all these women in good condition. The exit of foreign partners who left, will it help that Russians now can make quality product themselves? Well, actually, it's a wishful thinking. In order to set up production lines, you need to get equipment somewhere, but equipment could be bought only abroad. Experts calculated that about 1 million people left Russia from the beginning of the war. Almost the same number went to the front and to service the military machine. The budget lost money, taxes. What sectors suffered the most because of the draft and loss of population? Well, this is car industry, oil and gas sector, finance sector, IT, and agriculture. If we look at the lack of VAT, and this is a fundamental tax for the budget, so that tells you a lot. To put the economy on the military track, how the average people will feel that? Well, they're not going to lose anything. They're not going to gain anything either. What they will see, they'll see the very expensive goods, less of those goods, and nothing will change for them. More expensive spare parts for their cars, more expensive lubricants for their cars. Yet some goods can be less expensive because it's a classical crisis of overproduction. For example, with grains, we have very low price for the grain. It's bad, and we don't have storage facilities for the grain. And next year, agriculture industry will plan for less sowing. The war track is not so great. This year and the next year, most of our people, they will only lose. If they don't go to the movies, to cinema, they may say they never went to the cinema and they never watched American blockbuster. Certainly they didn't watch, for some reason, Russian film Crimea the Return, and people like lying when they're surveyed, and they may say, I never watched American blockbuster, and then what did you see in the cinema then? So anyway, these industries, they don't exist anymore. But people say, whatever. Their consumption cycle is home, work, work, home, cheap products in the store, and for their greatness they have a TV. So it's enough for their consumption. They will never feel it, these average people. To work under the conditions of defense emergency, they have a coordination council that is chaired by Prime Minister Mishustin. How this body will work? There is a conflict of laws here. Mishustin is probably chairing 8 or 7 different councils. Kind of everybody is a member of everything. And it's a conflict of laws. Who actually is running the country? Is it coordination council or the government? A little bit of government here and a little bit of council there, because people are the same. And in fact, decisions of coordination council can be in conflict with the decisions of the government, and here we have a conflict of laws. So nothing fundamental changed. Will it be an imitation of activity or a real help to the front? So don't supply anything to the front. Why? There is no need for that. In other words, you want to say that everything that is needed they have for the war. No, don't supply anything to the front. Why? Why to destroy your resources that will be destroyed anyway? Why to provide them with uniforms? Of course, if you were assigned to do that, you would answer exactly like this. But Mishustin have to follow the order. Well, if I was Mishustin and my career and all my businesses were engaged in this, and then I would create a coordination council, and it's like a task of a Soviet official. It never changed since then. As soon as they get an order, they have to follow the order, and it's ideal, and then they just imitate this teaming activity. They even had a special term for that during the Soviet time, and still have. Economists say that there is still money for the work, but where to buy high technology equipment to produce military equipment? Well, see, they have a lot of money. They're not gonna spend it, and the task is not to buy anything. The goal is different. The goal is to make people an alive shield in the front and not to spend the money. They just save the money. Will people feel all the so-called goodies of the war economy? People's disposable income is falling for 10 years, and it's a great news for so-called special military operation. Before it was bad and people were overcoming difficulties, and now they're overcoming difficulties again. People have a few trillions of rubles in the banks. Should they cash the money? Is there any danger to their savings? Well, if you have it in the bank. Well, the problem is, if the authorities will want to take the money out of the banks, to take it from the people, they'll do it. They will shift the economy to the food stamps, and money as a payment facility will not exist anymore. Well, Dmitri, could you tell us to keep the money on the deposit and get the interest, but to keep it, or better to keep it under the mattress? If the authorities make a decision to take away your money from your bank account, then your money, your cash, changes into plain paper. What you do, you live in the logic of peaceful life. But here, during the wartime, you will have a completely different thing. It's completely different payment instruments. Your money will become a thing for coin collectors. Well, could you explain better? So today we'll issue new money and your money is just nothing. So you see, you will be getting everything from a distribution system. What you do, you can try to live in the paradigm of a free time, a time free of war, and it's wrong perception of what's happening, and it's unacceptable. But what about dollars and euros? Will they save the situation? Again, the same story. And that's why they say bullets, matches, and canned meat. This is the payment instrument. It's a different currency. It is a payment instrument if you can exchange it. If not, then it's just plain paper. I remember when Gorbachev was in power, they had money and food stamps, so the story can be repeated, right? Yes, money and the food stamps, this is a payment instrument, and that's the point of the government, of this state. The state as a superstructure that people put on their head. It is that official determines how much your work costs and how you interact with your counterparties. Why to have private money? Private money, the issue is not the state. But what do you think if Europe completely rejects Russian oil? Well, nothing is going to happen. The key thing now is that Europe manages to stop buying Russian oil. I think it will be buying it anyway through India, China, or Tehran. Economists say that the budget of Russia will lose billions of dollars and there will be less money for the war. Is it an alarming signal for the Kremlin? Well, it tells us that war costs pennies, and there are tons of money for the war, and the war could be continued for decades. And sadly, huge economy of Russia spends very little for the war. There are less incomes, but for this they still can destroy Ukraine and can destroy many other countries. And if you don't understand this premise, it can be proved by any simple mathematics. In other words, no economic sanctions that are introduced by those procrastinators from Europe do not work, because they work for a long term, but Ukraine is destroyed today, here and now. Do you understand it right that Russia's fate will be decided on the front? Yes, always. I keep saying that from the first day of the war. But everything else, ban on visas to Russians, this is all imitation of teaming activity, and all these people who are celebrating that Russian students are expelled from institutes in Czech Republic, for example. So what? So they're not patriots of Ukraine at all, they're enemies of Ukraine, for sure, because the energy of people and politicians is spent on imitation of teaming activity. Using metaphorical language, we would say that HIMARSs will say their last word, right? Well, we can speak metaphorically, but in May we were discussing that, and everybody was saying this, there will be like 50 or 70 HIMARSs, and I said, no, it's not going to be like that, it's just 20 of them we have, and it's really about nothing. The West works in the logic that whoever survives in this war, and politicians of the EU works in the same paradigm. They're just those procrastinators. They're kind of warming their plates, and they're not on the side of Ukraine at all. But nevertheless, the military aid comes from NATO. It's bullshit. 200 billion comes to Russia for gas, and $5 billion comes to Ukraine. 205 is just bullshit, it's just keep Ukraine kind of alive. Yes, I'm not mistaken, $5 billion is sent to Ukraine and $200 billion goes to Russia. And the gap is 40 times. What are we discussing here? These are all those freaks who are all the time talking about this. So Russia is selling less gas and all that. How much less? I told you, war costs pennies. Does anyone want Ukraine to win? Nobody wants Ukraine to win. They just want to have this imitation of teaming activity. Concerts and flags and stuff. So for every flag that is lit, I was just traveling across Europe. I would fire those officials who are lighting the flags. Better use this money to buy product packages for the refugees. That's true, but all the rest is hypocrisy. And that's just criminal action against Ukraine. So what's going to happen to Ukraine economy? Well, physically it doesn't exist. That's a problem. Ukraine does not produce its own weapons, and without Western money, Ukraine economy does not exist.